Without further ado, I would love to introduce these three wonderful panels. First of all, Heidi Kim. She's an educator and an Episcopalian living in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She currently serves as the director of the Melrose Family Center for Servant Leadership at the Breck School. She previously served as the staff officer for racial reconciliation for the Episcopal Church for 5 years. The Reverend Winnie Varghese is a priest at Trinity Church, Wall Street. She is from the Diocese of Los Angeles, so we claim her our own. She served as the curate at St. Alban's Westwood, an Episcopal chaplain to UCLA, where I am currently serving as rector. Dr. Gale Yee is Nancy King Professor of Biblical Studies Emerita at Episcopal Divinity School, which I went to. She's the author of many books, and she was the president of the Society of Biblical Literature in 2019. She currently lives at Pilgrim Place, a retirement community in Claremont, California, known for its social activism. So please welcome all our panelists. I know you can't hear the clapping, but people are clapping on the screen. So I've asked the panelists to take about 7 minutes to share how their Asian Pacific American identity met their theology. The question was, how are you thinking theologically these days as an Asian Pacific American, and how have recent events of the world like COVID-19 or racism that got worse in the light of COVID-19 has influenced your thoughts and practices? I will go reverse in alphabetical order, which puts Gale as our first presenter.
Sorry. Dang. Okay. First of all, I want to thank my former student, Yein Kim, for inviting me to be on this panel with my excellent co-presenters, Heidi Kim and Winnie Varghese. When I taught at Episcopal Divinity School, I had all my students fill out this self-inventory that was used for all classes in Bible at New York Theological Seminary. And there were about 18 categories in this self-inventory, such as gender, race, ethnicity, class, religion, political party, and so forth. And students were asked which of these categories were operative when they interpreted the biblical text. I mean, do you remember doing this, Yein, in my class? Now, discussing this survey was not only a way to get the students to introduce themselves, but also to make them aware of the forces at work in their study of the Bible, whether they were conscious of them or not. And we on this panel are asked and tasked to do a similar self-inventory by reflecting theologically on our identities as Asian Pacific American Christians, specifically Episcopalians, in today's tumultuous world. Who shall we be? Now, my identity and social location are a hybrid mix as a female who grew up in a large patriarchal Chinese American family in the slums of Chicago, and as a Roman Catholic, now Episcopalian. So besides the usual triad of gender, race, and class, I am adding religion into my self-inventory. I am highlighting my Roman Catholic roots because I am not a cradle Episcopalian, and it's these Roman Catholic roots that inspire what I have to say theologically on this panel as an APA Christian. My mother was converted to Catholicism by Father Cassidy of Holy Name Cathedral in Chicago. And she became such a zealous Roman Catholic that she converted my grandmother and my whole extended family of 9 aunts and uncles. She was such a Roman Catholic that she believed in rhythm as a birth control, and she gave birth to 12 children, of whom I am the oldest. She was such a Roman Catholic, a zealous Roman Catholic, that we children said the rosary every day, went to Mass every day, because the family that prays together stays together. I went to a Catholic university, Loyola in Chicago, but I rebelled against my Catholicism and Loyola's 4-course theology requirement by putting atheist, agnostic, I made up a religion on my registration just to get out of these courses. Now, how I ended up as a biblical scholar teaching first at a Roman Catholic university and then in an Episcopal seminary is another story in itself. Suffice to say that my Roman Catholicism was an integral part of my identity for 52 years before I was received into the Episcopal Church in 2001. I also have to say that the multi-ethnic Episcopal parish I belong to, St. Paul's in Pomona, is filled with ex-Roman Catholics, and its rector is a former Franciscan monk, Mark Hallahan. Now, what keeps a big part of me in Roman Catholicism is its incarnational, creation-centered, and sacramental theology and spirituality, and its particular ethical focus on social justice. Now, what I mean by incarnational is that it is very body-centered. Its theology and spirituality are very embodied. And we see this in our liturgies when we use our bodies, when we dip our fingers into the holy water and make the sign of the cross, to genuflect, to sit down, to kneel, to get up. We use our bodies to receive and taste the body and blood of Christ at communion for nourishment. Other senses of our bodies are stirred in hearing and in smell, in the songs that we sing, in the use of incense and bells in our liturgy. The creation-centered aspect of my Catholicism emphasizes what the Bible says when God first created our bodies, that God saw that it was good, and that the goodness of our bodies participates in the goodness of all creation. Because our bodies were created good, the dignity of the human person becomes a core value of Catholic social teaching, that there must be available to all human persons everything necessary to lead a life truly human. Food, clothing, shelter, the right to employment, education, and so forth. Our bodies were not meant to be solitary selves. The Bible says it was not good for the human being to be alone, but in relation with other bodies. We are created for community, and we must ensure that bodies in this community have everything necessary for a life truly human. Now, also very dear to me are the sacraments of my Catholic faith, the outward signs of our inward grace. Each of these sacraments are intimately attached to special moments in the life, events, and passages of our bodies. Baptism, when our bodies are born into a new life with Christ. Eucharist, when we are nourished at the table of the Lord. Confirmation, when we receive the Holy Spirit who guides us in our daily lives. Reconciliation, when we need to repair bonds with other bodies and community. Marriage, when we covenant ourselves with another special person in his or her bodiliness. The anointing of the sick, when our bodies are afflicted with sickness or injury. Now, the seventh sacrament is holy orders, which Roman Catholicism tragically restricts to male bodies. But it is a sacrament in the Episcopal Church which proudly administers to female bodies. So what does all this Catholic stuff have to do with APA bodies? Well, APA bodies are created by God and are created good. APA bodies exist in relation and in community with other APA bodies. And when we look into the mirror, we see an APA body. Our bodies mark us as Asian Pacific Americans in the color of our skins, in the shape of our eyes, our noses, our lips, in the coarseness of our hair, in the languages and dialects that come forth from our mouths. All these wonderful aspects of our bodies mark us visually different from the white bodies that dominate our society, particularly during this time of COVID. And it is because of our APA bodies that we are seeing terrible ethnic slurs flung at us, slurs which I refuse to utter in this forum. I mean, sticks and stones do break our API bones and names do hurt us. Although many of us APAs have been here for generations, we are told to go back where we came from. Anti-Asian violence against our bodies have surged because of the COVID pandemic, labeled the Kung flu and China virus by our autocratic former president. APA homes and businesses have been defaced. APA bodies have been coughed upon and spat upon. APA bodies have been slashed and punched on trains. And one 84-year-old Thai body has died after being assaulted on the streets. Now, this time of Lent summons us to reflect on our identities as APA bodies. When I was young, Lent was a time to give up chocolate and not eat meat on Fridays. However, the fasting, abstinence, prayers, and almsgiving that Lent calls us to models what Jesus did during his 40 days in the wilderness, when he reflected on his own identity as the Son of God, where he was tempted to betray his identity and not fulfill his earthly mission. The season of Lent helps us to become aware of the vulnerabilities of our APA bodies, that we are mortal, that we are dependent not only upon each other, but more importantly, upon the Creator God who made us all good. And so I pray that we will make the most of this Lenten season to reflect upon who shall we be as Asian Pacific American Christians in our goodness, in our bodiliness, and with intimate connections with each other. God's blessing to all of you.
Thank you so much. And we will hear more from Gale as we move to the next section, but let's hear from Winnie about the same question, how her Asian Pacific American identity meets her theology in the current events of the world.
Thank you. So if I weren't so happy to be back in the Diocese of Los Angeles, I'd be mortified to have to follow Gale Yee. And so I knew enough to keep this very particular so that I wasn't trying to, I wasn't overlapping too much. That was really beautiful. Thank you. I need a minute to absorb that. I want to talk about just two things. One, solidarity as a political value and as a theological value, and I think a primary value for Asian Americans in the United States, a moral and ethical value. And then the particularity of our stories as Asian Americans, this category that has been created, a political category for political movements and power that now is in a time when it is being taken apart, so that the particularity of immigration stories and of stories of people that have been here for 5, 6, 7 generations and people like me that are one generation can be told authentically and from the parts of Asia that we are from. So it's important always to remember that Asia is just very, very big. The idea that Afghanistan, and Japan are contained in the same thing, the same word in such a small word is absurd. And yet, Asian American identity has a very particular and important political history and purpose in this country. And so solidarity, two things. One, there was a march yesterday, or a rally, sorry, we don't get to march right now, a socially distanced, safe rally and Foley Square, which is Federal Plaza here in New York City. And it was to highlight anti-Asian violence here in New York City, as we've already referred to. There have been horrific acts of direct violence, absolutely influenced by the former president and the hate speech around us, that one of the points of isolation that we are feeling in this, I think, as Asian Americans, is that it's happening to us from many different communities. So it's so solidarity, right? So so in that yesterday, in standing out there to support my friend and colleague who was organizing that rally, our senator was there, a local elected representative who is Chinese American, all of the other people of color groups were well represented. It was a profound act of solidarity. And I found myself standing out there almost in tears, not quite, but almost in tears. I think a little bit because we don't get to be outside anymore and see people, which is nice to see people. But I think because I didn't actually know who stands with us, who are the people that would choose to stand with us. And it was powerful to stand with others in that moment. And you could see where the South Asians were and where different groups of other people were, but that we would stand up outside with signs, making ourselves vulnerable to passing violence, because the violence on the street is pretty overt at this point, with big signs that say Asian on them. And the guardian angels, as problematic, right? But we're behind us. And I have to say, I don't know that I've ever been so grateful to see guardian angels. I took some pictures because it was really interesting that the guardian angels had come to show their solidarity in that moment. So I say solidarity as a theological idea, not just a political idea. My family is from Kerala, which is in the southwest of India. And in terms of particularity of story, I am from a generation that would call ourselves South Asian in the attempt to be inclusive. In this generation of people that are much younger than me, it's very important to be particular. Indians like me are the dominant group. North Indians are really the dominant group. I'm a South Indian, but still we are dominant. And so it's important to say India so that we're not silencing Bangladeshis and Pakistanis and Sri Lankans and Nepalese and Tibetans, and it kind of goes for a while, right? In a beautiful way. So as an Indian, where I'm from in Kerala, there's there's a heritage of Christianity. And in that heritage, our story is that at least from the 5th century, if not from the 1st, there have been Christians in our community, brought there because there are Jewish colonies in our communities, settlements of Jewish people who have been there since well before the time of Jesus. And so disciples of Jesus and communities that followed Jesus would have easily come because those communities were already established to see their colleagues in this safe place that was established after in place by the fall of the Second Temple, and that all that is well documented and very important to our community. But it means that I come from a Christian heritage in India. And that community is problematic and is glorious, like any Christian community, but it's never been the dominant community. We are not the community of government. We are not the princely community, but we are a minority community, but a very well-established minority community. So there are wealthy people, there are poor people, and there are people that live with caste and observe it within all of our community does, which is extremely problematic and troubling. And I raise it because when you come to the United States, those pieces of home that we carry in our identities can just feel like pride. This is who I am, right? This is something I can be proud of in a place that says my skin is too dark, that I am a subject of violence, right? That I am dangerous. It's part of the story of who we are that our parents can tell us that make us proud of where we've come from. But deeply problematic stories when looking back at what actually the reality on the ground is in Kerala and has been historically in Kerala. And the resource I have for that theologically, and I'm so grateful for it, is people like M.M. Thomas, who are writing in the 50s. And that work is in English because of the World Council of Churches. In some ways, before liberation theologies as we know it in the Protestant tradition, and he's writing as a Marthamite, so Protestant and Orthodox, Reformed and Orthodox, pointing to political solidarities, putting the story of Jesus into the life of an India that is emerging from colonialism, claiming Jesus for the side of Indians, speaking as a Christian resisting caste, and critiquing his own society while doing that, his own communities, his own family, and leading within a context. And again, if the contradiction isn't hitting you clearly enough, the Anglican Church was the Church of Britain, right? The British left in the 40s. The entire youth of people like Thomas and my father would have been spent, first the British should go, and then how do we rid ourselves of this influence in our local communities so that we are no longer starving one another in our communities? So he writes into that context and gives us this political idea of deep solidarity with the most vulnerable among us, and a critique of ourselves as Indians. And I think it's really important that we bring that story of ourselves into the immigrant experience. So here in the US, that same critique is valid, if not as visible, because those people that you would see day to day being treated horribly by our society disappear in the great immigration story, where we are less than 1% of this country, right? Our communities are so separated from one another, and our churches are segregated. So I say solidarity because the church I come from, if I wasn't critical about who I am in America and who we are as Indians in India and here, could easily be a very idealistic story that only talks about the color of my skin, right? And how Indian people are perceived, and not an understanding of how we carry with us injustice, and we can enact that easily, that we bring privilege with us, as well as our social location here in the United States. So solidarity is a primary value for me because it comes from my family and the heritage I come from, and I think is right. And it means in this country that we acknowledge that the only reason people like me can be in this country in my generation is because the Civil Rights Act passed, that Black Americans fought a liberation movement that meant that my parents' generation could immigrate to this country. And my parents were very aware of why they were here, and I'm so grateful for it. The ironic part of that would be that my parents, my uncle, my closest family came to the United States. My dad came because of his brother, who came to study theology. So I just find that ironic you can probably think of why, but I'll tell you a little bit of why. My aunt and my cousin died in the past year. So this is our COVID story. They did not die of COVID. They died in Houston and in Dallas of other things, but we couldn't go because of COVID. So in a family and in a community where we go just if you're in the hospital, we all show up and we stand there until you're out. When our first cousin of our generation died, we couldn't go to Houston. It wasn't safe. When his mother died a few weeks later, because her son had died, right, died of grief, we couldn't go. And so my cousin started sharing these pictures on Facebook that they had in their photo albums. And I don't have any of these pictures, and I'm a baby in them. My mother's holding me. And there's my aunt as a young woman, and there's my cousin who's died as a 4-year-old or 5-year-old. And we're all remembering these stories. And I'm noticing that they are standing on the grounds of Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, because they were all students at Perkins. They came to study theology. And then when they decided to go to church, they couldn't. When all those Indians showed up or tried to show up in numerous Protestant churches, they weren't welcome. And so they built their own churches. We built Marthoma churches, Church of South India churches, Orthodox churches, and that's where I grew up. And so we understand what racism is from that experience. What I experienced is a very empowered experience of my parents building their churches from scratch, and I remember it, right? But as an Episcopal priest, I also know the history of our families. None of them would have chosen to build a church from scratch. They were told to go to church, to Episcopal churches when they showed up. My dad was told, but those weren't places that were welcoming of them in that generation, and places I think that still struggle to understand that history and to tell our history well. So I think I've covered the two areas. Those are my 2 points, solidarity and particularity. And I'm happy to continue the conversation later. Thank you.
Thank you, Winnie. Solidarity and particularity. We'll remember that. All right, Heidi, last but not least. Please share how your Asian Pacific American identity meets your theology.
Sure. Yeah, it's tough to go after Professor Yee and Winnie Varghese. But I'm very honored to be here. You know, my story is a little bit different. You know, a lot of you who know me, and it's really good to see lots of familiar names in the group here. know that I refer to myself as a disobedient layperson, but my mother is a theologian. So my mother's grandfather was one of the first ordained Christian ministers in South Korea. And she came to the United States as an international student on a PEO scholarship, which is an American Women's Christian Organization. Through some crazy circumstances, she ended up as an international student at Union Theological Seminary in like 1955. Then studied with people like Paul Tillich and Reinhold Niebuhr and all of those people. And so she, she had this heart for theology. She had a heart for Christianity. She met my father in New York City. They got married there. My oldest brother was born there. They went back to Korea. They were both teaching and they were academics. My father was a dentist. And then decided to permanently emigrate to the United States when I was 1 because of the political and economic instability in South Korea at that time. So I pretty much grew up in a small town in Iowa. I grew up in Muscatine, Iowa. And at some point, my mother felt a call to ordained ministry. And we had been attending this Methodist church, similar to Winnie's story, that we were kind of odd. We were odd people out. They were nice enough in Iowa to not tell us we couldn't go. But when my mother approached the pastor there about her feeling a call to ordained ministry, he just said, what could an Oriental woman possibly offer to God's people? I think he called her a chink. A very Christian kind of response to somebody's expression of a desire to become, an ordained Christian minister. So, I didn't go to church. That was a sort of an early part of my formation as a Christian, was understanding that churches were racist, misogynist, homophobic, anti-immigrant, all of those things. But, I liked going to church when I went with friends. And I actually became an Episcopalian, as many of you in LA know, in the Diocese of Los Angeles, because I got paid to sing in the choir at St. John's, LA, which was predominantly Afro-Caribbean. This was like 1994, 1995, maybe, something like way back then. And I was like, this high church thing is like really amazing. I loved it. It was very like, we sang it was an Afro-Caribbean parish, and we sang all of the sort of high WASP Anglican choral tradition, which I absolutely loved. The piece took 25 minutes because you had to go and hug everybody. And I thought that that's what the Episcopal Church was like. So, my formation, my introduction to the Episcopal Church was very much through a Black tradition in the Episcopal Church in the United States. And I would say that my sort of political coming of age and my political awareness was also kind of when I went away to college on the East Coast and spent a lot of time with African-American students, activists, kind of getting politicized in that way. So Polly Shigaki is on this call. And when I was in the Diocese of Olympia, I was on the Commission on Ministry, and I got to be the liaison for Polly as she was going through her process of being ordained to the diaconate. And I wept when Polly was ordained. I weep every time an Asian American woman is ordained. I'm going to start crying now. That sense, that we were not the embodiment of the word, as Gale was talking about. It's very moving for me to actually hear your story, Gale, just to think about, what does it mean to be sort of in this incarnational space that we find ourselves in? And really, I think what I found is, my parents both learned very early on as immigrants to the US that racism was a really important thing to understand. My mother, the first book that she read in English was Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington. My father, on the other hand, the first person that he became friends with was a German immigrant who taught him to hate Black people and Jewish people. So both of them sort of internalized these messages about racism. My mother did her undergraduate at Scarrett College in Nashville, Tennessee, and she said that's where she became an American because she saw racism towards African Americans every single day. So I had these two very different parents, very different ideas about what is it about the racial landscape of the United States and what does it mean for us as a Korean American immigrant family living in Muscatine, Iowa. So I think for me, in my adult life, what it means for me as an Asian American woman, as a Korean American lay woman trying to engage racism in this moment, is that my call as a disciple is to disrupt white supremacy. Because I am watching Asian American people being spit on, having acid thrown on them. And I wonder, and this is sort of related to what Winnie was talking about in terms of solidarity. I wonder if we are now hearing about more of these hate crimes because those stories are also covering the fact that the assailants who are being charged are African American as opposed to white. Because when white people were killing and throwing acid on Asian American people, it was not in the New York Times, but now it is. I was in Los Angeles during the post-Rodney King uprisings, and I remember the ways that Korean people were being sort of taught to see Black people as the enemy and vice versa. And I thought, you know, this is how white supremacy is trying to pit us against one another. And so, you know, for me, the theology is really about, you know, learning to, trying to embody my own sort of sense of who am I as a disciple, as a follower of Jesus, which is that I am called to love. And one of the ways that I am called to love is by trying to disrupt white supremacy. I happen to live in a place and in a neighborhood where I have been pretty safe when I've had to go out in public spaces. I was worried that at my school, there would be parents who would say, I don't want my child to be taught by an Asian person because they might bring COVID. That did not happen. I've been told that they may actually be thinking that, but they wouldn't say that because that's kind of a thing about Minnesota nice, I guess, which is sort of passive aggressive and not quite so in your face. But that doesn't, you know, that doesn't mean that, you know, I'm not seeing that, you know, Asian restaurants are struggling, and that that there is as people are sort of thinking about the movement of justice for George Floyd, nobody's talking about the fact that there was an Asian American police officer who is one of the 4 people who is charged in the murder of George Floyd. We're not kind of surfacing those things. We're sort of trying to kind of gloss it over. And the fact of the matter is, when I was working in the Episcopal Church, because the Episcopal Church tends to see the question of race and racism in the Black-white binary, you know, there was just not a way for us to think about, well, you know, how do we think about anti-Asian violence, and how do we think about anti-Asian violence if it comes from Black people? In the same way that in Los Angeles in the 90s, when Sun Jia-do shot Latasha Harlins in her store, there was no way of us to think about, well, is that really racism in the same way if it's a Korean person who was shooting this young Black girl in her store? And I think for me, the theology is, you know, it's not about we're going to take sides. You know, it is about solidarity. It is about being these embodied persons made in God's image. And it is also about remembering that, you know, the sin, the evil that surrounds us is this notion of white supremacy that would pit us against one another, that would make us feel that the world that we live in is, you know, only a certain amount of goods, and that we have to fight each other for them, as opposed to thinking about what are the ways that we can embody something that is greater. And if we are Christians, you know, we as Episcopalians, we make all those promises in our baptismal covenant. And if I'm really going to respect the dignity of every human being, you know, I'm really struggling with that right now, because I don't know how to respect the dignity of Derek Chauvin, because I don't know how to respect the dignity of a person who holds his knee on a man's neck for 9 minutes. And as a Christian, I'm called to deal with some of that, right? And so, you know, it's not my place to be the person who's going to persecute Derek Chauvin. I pray for those 4 police officers. I pray for the city. You know, our trial is coming up here. We start jury selection on March 8th. And I feel that my place in this is to remember that as a person who is called to love, especially when I don't want to do it, that is what is needed in this moment. Because I have some economic age and educational privilege, I'm not necessarily in the line of fire. I live in a pretty, you know, bougie neighborhood in Minneapolis that everybody's out walking their dogs, even when it's 20 below, and everybody knows each other. And there's a kind of safety that comes with that. And, you know, how do I leverage that privilege? How do I leverage that comfort that I have? How do I leverage that sort of tenuous feeling of safety that I have in this moment to create opportunities for the community as a whole, to not think about this in terms of the binary, but to think about it in terms of, you know, the necessity as Christians to disrupt white supremacy and to disrupt these systems that would pit people of color against one another. Is that good, Yein? Can I stop now?
I mean, honestly, I can hear all 3 of you for hours and days, and I'm sorry I had to stop you. So the follow-up question, which was a great segue, Heidi, was that then how does the Eurocentric systematic biblical theology that we're taught as the mainstream engage or doesn't engage who you are? And we're all Episcopalian, so how does the Episcopal Church's theology and practices speak to your or our marginality? Gale, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm thinking, see, again, I mean, I'm looking at because as a biblical scholar, I was trained in that Eurocentric, you know, white supremacy notion of what it means to study the Bible. And it was mostly men, white men. But there's also, I mean, again, I have to go back to my Roman Catholic roots because I didn't study the Bible when I was a kid, and you know, the Bible in Roman Catholicism wasn't as strong as it is in Protestantism. So I am not held to, you know, the authority of the Bible that I know my Protestant friends are. And so therefore, quote, the hermeneutic of suspicion, you know, came very easily for me. I mean, I was able to see the sexism, the racism, and homophobia of the biblical text and say, this is not the word of God. So, I mean, that's where the Roman Catholicism came in my study of the biblical text. So, I mean, yeah. So that's why, you know, I was able to, you know, throw off some of the Eurocentric stuff, you know, and really come in, you know, the contextual interpretation of the Bible, the feminist interpretation of the Bible, you know, post-colonial, all of that became, because it was very easy for me to see, not, you know, that the Bible did not have the hold on me authoritatively as it did for some of the other people that I know. So that's how I would approach that, again, from my own profession as a biblical scholar.
Yes, and if you put Gale Yee in Amazon, you can look up all the books that she's written. And all of them, you can read further on what she's saying here. Winnie, Heidi mentioned a little bit about how the Episcopal Church sees the racism as binary. Would you say something to that?
Yeah, and to the last question as well, right? So like Heidi's mom, I went to Union, and I'm very grateful for that education. And one of the things I did my undergrad in religious studies as well. So I swear to God, this I really got it at Union, is when we do theology or biblical studies without values, right, without any particularity, right? If it's just, you're just talking about grace, right? My very, flip line recently has been, in my world, the white people really like grace. I've been hanging out with a lot of Lutherans, and grace is important. I'm so grateful for grace in my life, but you can see how, that works, right? And that we have to be very particular or we don't notice the privileging that our theology and the power dynamics within our theology. And you've got to be particular, and you can read that in when you read authors that are using a liberationist perspective, contextual perspective. That particularity takes things apart and sees things that we don't see otherwise. And so on this issue of race, so I'd say a weakness of my training, and it's just a critique I have, is it kind of creates hierarchies in racism in a very American context, right? And I just disagree that that idea that we're going to rank our oppression is just a bad idea, in my opinion. And I think another way to think about that might be more helpful is white supremacy is influencing all of us, impacting all of us, breaking us apart from one another, which is why solidarity is so important. But also that whiteness, as opposed to being held up high sometimes, might just be smarter to just put in the center, and that we're all kind of around it and we all face it. It's not my experience that any person of color is saying, if I just could be that other person of color, that we've ranked as a more powerful person of color. I've never heard, and I'm not even going to list that, but you know what I mean, right? When the way that we rank who has more or less privilege, I've just never heard a person say, I'd like to be that one, because that's a little bit better. It's just not how it works. We all face whiteness. We all do. And whiteness is the only thing we face. We're not doing that through other people, through other categorizations. And I think that is something that communities, that the Episcopal Church does not do this well, but the Episcopal Church, which I learned at St. Albans in Westwood, I had never thought about how white the Episcopal Church was until someone out on the courtyard at St. Albans said, I said something about a diversity meeting, and they said, but aren't most Episcopalians white? And I'm from, Holy Faith in Inglewood. I didn't know most Episcopalians were white, but as she said, I was like, oh, that's probably true. I don't know. I was a priest at the time, which I'm kind of embarrassed to say. It had just never occurred to me. And so the church is taking some steps and has a very good analysis in some places and has a lot of work to do in some very particular areas. But there's also a long history of Asian Americans in this church and in this country. I'm not young, and there are plenty of Asian Americans around when I was a kid, and that are Anglicans, and that are not received in this church. This church has a great comfort sometimes with very new immigrants, but not with the rest of us. And I don't think that's unintentional. So there's a lot of work to do. And that's not about a hierarchy. That's about being the church that we're supposed to be.
Thank you. And you briefly mentioned it, Heidi, and I'm sure now you can speak more freely about the Episcopal Church now that you don't work for the Episcopal Church. Could you go a little deeper on what you said about the binary understanding of racism?
Sure. My parents grew up under Japanese colonization, so their initial experience of racism was with the Japanese. And the Japanese came to Korea and they said, you're no longer Korean, you're Japanese, but you're second-class Japanese. We're going to destroy all of your literature, all of your architecture. We're going to destroy everything, and you're now second-class Japanese. My mom tells a story from when she was a very young child of seeing this girl who had these shoes that she really loved. But she was not allowed to love those shoes because they were Japanese shoes, right? So that stuff is just very, very deep. I remember saying that in the interim body that was dealing with racism in the church, and a Black woman told me, oh, that's not racism, that's tribalism. And I was very well behaved, and I did not hit anything or break anything in that moment. She later kind of did some research, and she came back and she apologized to me. But there was that kind of notion, that weird kind of competitive ranking and the hierarchical thing. And I was also, I was a layperson. So I was not only not Black or white, I was also not a priest. So, shut up and sit down. And, that's kind of not, it's not really how I operate. But, part of, I would say, the advantage of being a layperson and not having a theological degree, although I would have loved to have studied with Professor Yee, is that, I don't have this sort of entrenched ways of understanding biblical stories. And I think that that's been a real advantage for me, because right now I'm teaching sixth graders Hebrew scriptures. And what I've discovered is that sixth graders will take that Adam and Eve story and they will turn it on its head. So last year, I had a transgender student and a gender nonconforming student, and we read the story of Adam and Eve. And they came away with, well, if Eve comes from Adam's rib, isn't Eve transgender? And another student said, yeah, I kind of feel like this story is telling us that, first of all, maybe God is really sexist, but also maybe God wants us all to be gender non-binary. And so their understanding of the Adam and Eve story coming in with fresh eyes is kind of like, yeah, let's talk about that. And when we read the Cain and Abel story, you know, I had a Black student who said right away, you know, well, I feel like this Cain and Abel story could be used to justify the enslavement of people because they have the mark of Cain. And I was like, okay, you're 12 years old, preach. And so I feel like because I don't have that deep theological education, it's much easier to say like, yeah, let's talk about it. What do you think? So I had to go out and find different translations. I went and got the Inclusive Bible, right? Because it has very different language and it doesn't have gendered language for God. And the kids were asking me like, why does the Bible have gendered language for God? Do we know? You know, and at 6th grade boys, they'll say, is God a boy or a girl? And I just would say, what do you think? It's like, well, how would we possibly know? And why would God, if God is all knowing and all seeing, why would God have a gender? Right? Which is a very different place from like how I grew up understanding those stories. So I kind of feel like I you know, 12th grade, 12-year-olds can be hard, but they can also be really sort of encouraging in terms of how we might want to look at our theological traditions and our understandings of, you know, these deeply, deeply embedded stories in a new way, whether that is about race or gender or whatever it might be.
Thank you. You have the perfect segue for my next question all the time. So it's hard to pinpoint our identity as just Asian, like like Professor Gale talked about the hermeneutic inventory. You know, their gender comes into, you know, and race and all of that. What are other influence or factors that you attribute to your understanding of scripture development or theology and spirituality? We're all being a good Asian and nobody's speaking up. I'm gonna have to call on you. How about we start with Winnie?
Sorry, will you say that one more time? Just ask it. I'm not sure I understood it.
Not just being an Asian as our identity, but also other identities or influence and factors that you attribute to your understanding of scripture, theology, and spirituality.
Sure. So for me, I was raised in the church, Marthoma and Church of South India, but I had a real conversion moment in college, and I was reading. Actually, I was reading for a Bible class, and I had a moment of understanding. It really felt like I got it. Like I got what this faith part of the practice was, and it was the same moment that I came out. And I don't think that was by chance. It absolutely felt like a gift. It felt like it was given to me. It was a clarity given to me. And frankly, I don't know what my life, what life was possible if this me was born and raised in India, you know? And so it's complicated, right? It's really complicated. And for me, understanding what it means to be a Christian and really follow your own course, make your own way, which is a very immigrant story as well, comes from coming out, realizing my family of origin and my community of origin had no room for me. I basically had, if I were to be out, that was done. If I weren't out, I was privately alone, right? Just done. All those relationships were over. And finding early on that that I had to pick a community, I had to select community based on my values, which I kind of wish everybody was forced to do at 17, frankly, because I think people struggle with that their whole lives and are bound by family and expectation and all kinds of other things about themselves. And the thing about coming out for me is it was done. I had to, what was the point of hiding again? I remember that in my discernment process. What is, if my own parents, if I broke in that relationship, who cares what a bishop thinks, or a committee thinks? Like you got to be yourself. And I wish I could give that confidence to everybody, because like that break is so powerful. But it's really what our faith calls us to. Like ideally, we are in families and communities that are more skilled than that, and that can take who we are, as Heidi's describing, and it should grow. But if not, we are made to pursue those truths, right, in ourselves, and the whole community benefits from that. So my personal sense of approach to theology and to text, which also comes from how my parent, coming from a church, which the gift of building their own church is, I know you can build your own church. Some lay people can get together and decide they want to pray, and decide they want to do that in a room, and find a room to do that, and build a church if they want. That sense that the faith is ours and we carry it and we will sort it out, is strong for me. And I think it's one of the things that immigrants bring to the church, if we don't squash it.
Thank you. And Gale, could you tell us a little bit about the article that I asked you about, how you have developed the article in Puilan's edited book, how you have developed your identity?
Oh, I have the book here. I gotta find it though. Where's the book? Oh, here it is. This is the book that Yein is talking about. It is Asian and Asian American Women in Theology and Religion. Okay, and it was edited by my dear colleague Kwok Puilan, and I belong to a group. It's called Pacific Asian, North American Asian Women in Theology and Ministry, and it was a group of, and I mean, to go back to your original question, Yein, this was such a formative group for me in my own development of being Asian, basically. All right. Puilan in 1994 invited me to be on a panel at the American Academy of Religion it was something called the politics of identity, and its relationship to nationalism. It was some big long thing. And it was, I mean, that was where I would say, to use the word, it came out as an Asian American, okay? And because I really never thought of I knew I was an Asian American, but I never understood being what an Asian American was. I was as an advocacy stance, okay? I always knew I was a woman, but it was when I became a feminist, it was when I, advocated my feminism. I became a feminist advocate. And with that panel that Puilan invited me on, I became an Asian American, all right, an advocate, and became very involved in Asian American studies, and it was more professional for me. I became involved in the Ethnic Chinese Biblical Colloquium, Panautum, and it was a part of my formation. Okay, again, I'm 72 years old, so that becoming an Asian American took a journey. All right, it was different. It happened in different ways, being on this panel, becoming part of Panautum. And in this book, Puilan asked us how, and it's actually talked about embodied knowledge. So I had to go and, think about my embodiedness as an Asian American. So I went into, my story. All right. And some of it, I talked about, earlier, but also, I approach my Asian Americanness, in a developing way. All right. I was always asked to do this Asian American reading of the biblical text, and so it was, it was a it was a learning process for me, okay? But it also meant going into those questions of identity that we were talking about. I mean, how do I read, you know, I do remember one session I was at in the cited biblical literature where a Latinx biblical scholar, me, the Asian American scholar, an African American scholar, and a Native American scholar were to read 1 Kings 21, which was the story of Naboth's vineyard. You know, I'm not sure if you are familiar with that story, but it was King Ahab wanted this vineyard, and basically ripped him off and exploited him. Sorry, so we had to read this text from those for these 4 different perspectives, and it was, and from an Asian American perspective, it was a process to do that, and it was so interesting to see how, you know, African Americans did it, that interpreted that text, Latin Americans. So, you know, for me, it was a process of becoming, you know, you know, in what I described here in my own essay. And, you know, I think for most Asian Americans, it might be easier now because, you know, for me, I had no models of what it means to be an Asian American. Again, you know, I had no models in my college, in my graduate studies, and even for a long time when I taught at St. Thomas in Minnesota. I taught 14 years at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. And it was a process of becoming an Asian American that Puilan asked me to write about in that book. So I'm not sure if that was what. Yeah.
No, thank you. So they're already asking about the name of the book. So, and
I'll write it in. I'll put it in the.
It's Asian and Asian American Woman in Theology and Religion, and Gale's article is the first article in the book. So, Heidi, tell us a little bit more about your other identities outside of being American.
You know, as I said, I came to the Episcopal Church via the choir. So that's been a huge part of my role. That's been that was lay ministry for me, was I was always singing in the choir, right? So part of what choirs do is we sit up in the choir loft and we're like rolling our eyes during the sermon, or if somebody, you know, was doing something weird, right? And so, you know, that kind of sense of praying through these holy texts and these holy spaces, and it is very much, singing in a choir is very much an embodied experience. So I remember one of my sort of transformative aha moments was when I was singing Charles Villiers' Stanford Magnificat, and I am singing "My Soul Doth Magnify the Lord," and I'm pregnant, right? And that was like, I'm a mother, you know, like I did not necessarily know if I wanted to be married, but I knew that I wanted to have a baby. And like, so for a long time, I was just like, I just need to find a sufficient sperm donor and then I can do this shit on my own. It didn't kind of work out that way. I'm sorry, I swear I broke the seal on that one. Okay, so, but part of like being in that moment in the choir was I'm a mother. And then like a week later, I had a miscarriage. And so that whole sort of experience of singing the Song of Mary, like took on a very, very different meaning for me. And so I think part of how I have come to understand what the Episcopal Church is about is through music. And I have these conversations with Sandra Montes all the time, because for me, I came to the Episcopal Church through that very European Anglican choral tradition that I really, really loved. But having come, you know, through college and sort of that politicization of myself as an Asian American person, you know, in the 80s, I was good with that stuff. But I, you know, the religious identity was not really there for me. And so I really came to that through the choir. And through that very, powerful experience. And that was when I was singing at St. James in Koreatown, which I also loved. We all have these LA connections. And so, part of it has kind of just been, when you're in the choir and you're kind of consuming the service in a particular kind of way, and then you are participating in the service in a particular kind of way. It wasn't until much later that I realized like how much scripture we actually get in the Episcopal Church every Sunday as compared with other churches. I remember the very first time, when I was at St. James, and they said, well, you either have to come and take communion or you have to come and get a blessing at the rail, but everybody in the choir has to go to the communion rail. I'm like, oh, okay. And that was sort of when I started taking communion. And it was one of those things where I felt like, okay, I know what it's like when somebody comes to my house and disrespects the way I do things. So I've got to participate in this. But, I didn't have that sort of, like the way my kids did, the way my children learned about communion growing up in the church. But it was kind of this, what is this wonderful opportunity that I'm being given to partake in communion? Again, as the disobedient layperson who kind of didn't know anything, didn't know what I was supposed to know about communion, but just saw it as like, this is this really cool invitational thing, right? And yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. We will break out for about 15 minutes, and you will be able to answer this exact questions, what identities you attribute to your understanding of theology and Bible in your breakout rooms, and we will convene back for questions and answers about 15 minutes after. And Peter will explain further about the breakout rooms.
Thank you, Yein, and thank you, panelists, for such personal and also thought-provoking thoughts, things for us to really chew on together. And so we will have 15 minutes together in your breakout groups, and then we will return for question and answer time after that. I just posted the question for our breakout groups. So there will be 4 to 5 in a group. Go ahead and choose a facilitator to monitor the time and to make sure that everyone has time to share. And then in 15 minutes, we will bring you back for question and answer. So Ken and Melissa has organized the rooms, so you will get your summon pretty soon. Oh, there it is. We'll have a time for question and answer. Please continue to post your questions in chat, whether it's for an individual panelist or for the whole panel. And I want to acknowledge that the gathering is a space for Asian Pacific American spirituality, but we also welcome our allies to stand with us and share with our story. So we want to also just say that this is an ally-friendly space. So feel free to ask your questions. One of the questions that we have was for the panelists. In talking about your particularity, what specific cultural influences have changed the way you engage worship, theology, and spirituality? If you could share with us, I know Gale, you talked about Asian American reading of a biblical text. The question is, what establishments have you challenged through your APA identity? Give us examples as a way for us to follow. How have you done that in your ministry?
Can you give that question to me again?
Yeah. Well, the question hones in on particularities, which is if you could give us specific examples of for each of you, ways that you have, in some ways, pushed against the white Eurocentric normativity, especially in the Episcopal Church. What has that looked like? And if you could share that with us as a model for us to be inspired by.
Mm.
Gale, your article on Ruth and the model minority.
Oh, thank you. All right. You know, in fact, when I'm thinking about this, most of my activism has been in my writing, and having to do that, you know, I think while I was talking in my green room, doing what, trying to learn what Asian American biblical interpretation is. And one of the earliest articles I've done was on an Asian American reading of the Book of Ruth, where I read the Book of Ruth as a model minority and a perpetual foreigner. And again, this was also a learning experience for me, because really, as I was telling the people in my green room, the process of learning what it means to be Asian was a journey for me, was a journey. I mean, even though I was always an Asian American, always through my 72 years, acknowledging that as an identity came about in 1994, when I was invited by Kwok Kwilan to be on a group in the American Academy of Religion. And so learning about what it means to be Asian American, again, was a process for me. And because I did not have models of Asian American, let's see, at least in my profession, Asian American scholars or Asian American feminists or Asian American post-colonialists or Asian Americans, who did my work, who did my worked in my profession. It was a journey for me to actually learn that. So the way I pushed against it was actually through my writing and learning about how to be an Asian American. Now, let's say, for example, I've pushed against white racism all through my life, all right? But the way I was able to, really combat it as an Asian American was through, what my writing, and I have written a lot. So, I was able to do that in my writing. So again, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, Peter. And thank you. Who was it that mentioned, who read
I think it's Thomas.
Oh, Thomas. Okay, all right.
Thank you, Gale. And yes, absolutely, that article you wrote was very seminal and getting me to think about how we can look at scripture from an Asian American lens and read it very differently than traditional hermeneutics would tell us. Winnie or Heidi, would you like to add to that?
I was going to ask if you want the rest of us to answer. So two things. I'm remembering, I think because I'm seeing Yein sit in St. Albans, that the Sunday after 9/11, the two clergy on staff at St. Albans in Westwood were me and Norm Ishizaki. And we decided, if you remember that Sunday after 9/11, right, and being on the West Coast, we decided that we would both talk for about 10 minutes. And we didn't talk to each other about what we'd say, that we'd split the homily. We'd never done that before. And the first person that was murdered after 9/11 was an Indian guy in Arizona, planting flowers outside of his gas station, I think. And it was terrifying. It was a week that I had gotten note after note from other friends, South Asian friends, about what to do if the police knock on your door, and to not answer the door, and to call your lawyer, and who the lawyer was, because people were getting rounded up. And so I spoke very honestly, as an Asian from South Asia. And Norm was beautifully theological, and he's like 40 years older than me, right? It was a beautiful, and he was comforting. I hope I was too. But everyone knew his story. He was there's a picture of him as a 3-year-old on a tricycle in an internment camp that was posted whenever we did a happy birthday Norm thing, because that was the picture he had from age 3. So partly, frankly, it's important. Representation is important. And where, what you pick on that day, right? There was an Indian guy on the lawn on January 6th in the White House, from our community, like my community, had decided that's what he picked. Like, it matters what you pick and what you represent and how well we know our histories and how we speak them. And what we're willing to say. Like, one of the things we offer is I told the truth to that community as a 28-year-old who barely knew them and trusted them with how terrified I was. But how terrified I was extremely political, and I think theological, and accusing of our country, and in a church where everybody had shown up, God bless them, good people, right, with their SUVs with American flags in the window, which terrified me. If I could have turned around and gone home, I would have gone home. And they didn't know that about themselves. They didn't know what, anyway, so that. And then the other one is, I will tell you the story of Thomas and tell you a lighthearted version of some story that reminds people that Christianity didn't originate in England every opportunity I have. And I will tell it in a complicated way, and I will tell our complicated story, as Thomas points out in the chat, of who we are, where I come from. That it's not a simple story. We're not all innocent. We're not all vulnerable. We're not all starving. It's really complicated. That we come from complex communities. We can hold that, and we come to America as complex communities. And some of us come as generations and generations of Christians. And so I try to complexify the story of both Christianity and of Asia. And I usually do it in a pretty lighthearted way, but it's deeply meaningful for me. And I do it in a lighthearted way because, as Gale has said, telling the story of what it means to be Asian American, we are becoming Asian American as we tell these stories. And so Satnam Sangera and other people in the UK are writing about the Indian experience in particular in ways that, I'm 48 years old and I'm just starting to find language for things because they're writing about our generation growing up in the West, and their words finally for things I didn't know how to think about when I was in seminary, and I can put theological ideas against it because I can see those words.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Winnie. I was just continually reminded of the importance of telling our stories and being declarative about that which often can be left to the wayside or uninvited almost too. So we invite ourselves to that conversation. Thank you. Heidi, and would you add?
I'll be super brief. Kind of what came up for me is I'm just thinking about sort of my extended family. So my great aunt, who died just about a year ago, was a member of the largest Presbyterian church in the world in Seoul, and she was an elder in that church. And then kind of other uncles and aunts and the folks who immigrated to the United States who were affiliated with the United Methodist Church, who were celebrating and proclaiming victory when the UMC had their historic vote on human sexuality. And so my relatives are on social media proclaiming victory, in the name of homophobia. And so for me, it was just this really, really, really hard moment of, because I'm always posting stuff on my social media too. And kind of, these are my relatives whom I love. We claim that we are following the same Jesus, and we've interpreted that in very different ways. And so I think for a Korean American immigrant my age, and my children are 20 and 23, part of, this thing that I said earlier about feeling like I'm a mother because I was singing the Song of Mary is also sort of showed up in how I have the role that I've recognized that I play for young Asian Americans in their 20s and 30s whose parents are like my uncles and aunts, and who feel unable to come out or be fully who they are in their Asian American identity because of their gender identity or their sexuality. And so I think one of the ways that I am trying to be present as an Asian American in the church is because I look like somebody's mom or grandmother, because I'm that old, to be able to say, no, I see your full humanity, and you are beloved, and you know, come hang out in the Episcopal Church if the Methodist Koreans don't want you, because we want you over here. But that feels, my daughter's a lesbian, so I feel like this was really an important thing for me as a parent and as a person and as somebody, who I still, like, when I'm around Bishop Alan Shin, I still call him Bishop Shin because of that whole deferential thing. And so I'm still very much, I would call you Mother Varghese and Dr. Yee and like all of the things, right? Because of all that deferential baggage that I bring with me. But then recognizing what my role is in that as an elder, for younger people, or for who, I just became friends with an Asian American drag queen in Minneapolis, because she was talking about how much her very religious Asian family completely discounted her and they don't talk to her. And she was doing a thing with my school. And so I reached out to her, and now we've become friends. And I recognize that it's like my role to like kind of be the mother, right? To be the accepting older Asian lady, which I feel like I'm really kind of enjoying, actually. There's some freedom in that.
Thank you.
Somebody asked, and I asked this because 2 of the 3 in here are lay. So how might we encourage Asian Americans in their vocations, either lay or ordained?
I think we got to get rid of the deferential baggage.
Yeah, see.
I think we just have to throw that right out. Mm-hmm. And so part of why I identify as a disobedient layperson is to sort of give that invitation, right? And I was just having a conversation in my own diocese when we talk about lay ministry and the ministry of all the baptized. Well, yeah. Mm-hmm. Plenty of people come into church who haven't been baptized either. So what is your call? What is your vocation? And let's not make it, to be Korean and to be in the Episcopal Church with all of its hierarchy is like a really dangerous like setup, right? For just falling into all of the hierarchical nonsense. And I think we just gotta throw all that stuff out. And it's an ongoing struggle for me because I can't do it. I mean, I have to remind myself every day to try to not do it.
I don't know if how much this is true for other Asian American communities, but I'll say as an Indian and particularly as a Malayali, so the community I come from, what's actually really important is it's so hard for us to imagine ourselves doing anything that, like the career opportunities are literally, like, it's not even, it's a stereotype. You can go to medical school. You don't even get to be a dentist. We don't have those. You go to medical school. If you can't go to medical school, you can go to nursing school. There's certain kinds of engineering, and they'll tell you which ones. My parents told me because they thought I'd be good at that. And so if you're gonna, like, and I still hear young adults still will call to talk about this. They cannot imagine themselves in careers. Like, they can't imagine being an accountant, much less a priest. So I actually think the vocational piece isn't just, do you want to be ordained or not? It's that there's a lot of really great ways to live your life, beautiful, faithful, powerful ways to live your life. And let us help you explore them as your fellow folks in church. Like, we have this thing called vocation. So I'm not a Martin Luther vocation person. I don't, I think you gotta, there's a lot of I am from where I come from. There's some very practical considerations about vocation that you need to consider about the kind of life you want to lead, what gifts you have, your personality, that kind of thing. But we should be in that conversation, because the truth is, especially for immigrant kids and sometimes second generation, we can be very isolated, which isn't how I grew up, but it's how a lot of our folks grow up. And we're it for a conversation outside of that. So if we're not talking to young people about people that show up in your church or however you know them, about what's possible in their lives. Don't assume that they can imagine the same landscape of opportunity that you can. So I think it's really important to think about the kind of life you want to live and how you do that with integrity. And there are ways to do that.
Gale, would you like to add?
Well, I'm still stunned by your question. I mean,
It's not my question.
Pardon me?
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Am I understanding you correctly that you're wanting to know how many more, how we can get more priests into the Episcopal Church and vocations? Am I hearing that right?
No,
as Asian Americans?
not necessarily, but it could be.
Yeah, so the question was posed by Maureen Elizabeth. How might we encourage Asian Americans in their vocations, lay or ordained?
Oh, okay.
Not specifically towards priesthood. So.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think that's for every educator. Again, that's where I come from. I'm an educator, and it's not my duty to tell a student where he or she should be, but to help them understand their passions and direct their passions into, a vocation that they have gifts for and that they're suited for. And so, again, I'm trying to think of, when I worked in this, when I taught at EDS, there are people there, some who were, called to be priests, but there were many others who were called to be different lay vocations there. And so, this is what you support them in. What is it? What do they need to know to do what they want to do? Okay, so that's so that in a seminary. Now, it's been a long time since I've taught undergrad, and so I'm not sure. I'm so far removed from that population. But for at least in just the recent educational experience, it's trying to discern what the student's gifts are, even if he or she can't, don't know what they are, and then nurture that, and so into the vocation where they should be with those gifts. So, well, I'm glad you weren't, asking how to get more priests into the Episcopal Church. So.
Well, that's important too, but in general, finding vocations. And Thomas commented that EDS was not a priest factory. Lay vocations are absolutely respected.
Mm-hmm.
True that, yes. On a different note, we got a question that she has been having many conversations recently on racism and systems of oppression and privilege with older members of the church community who are mostly white and mostly 80 plus. And so often they hear that they either feel too old to change or make a difference, or that they struggle to understand what and why things might need to change or shift. Do you have any advice for engaging this population in such discussions?
I think we have to be really pastoral in those moments. I'm trying to imagine, a priest whose 3-year-old picture is in one of the camps. I had this conversation recently with some folks in Hawaii with this sort of older Chinese American congregation, and folks just don't want to talk about racism because it's still very real and it's a very much an embodied experience. And it's something that feeling like maybe they've come through a little bit, they don't want to kind of bring it up again. And so I think we need to be pastoral about that, but I think we can also be strategic about that, because their children and grandchildren are trying to have different conversations. And I'm an educator with very young people, so I always feel like, let's have the high school kids talk about their experience or how they're understanding racism, or how they're understanding the Black Lives Matter movement, or how they're understanding this current, very violent uptick in anti-Asian hate crimes. And, so that it's not about any of the kind of shame and blame that went with some of those early experiences, but that it's really about, thank you for your steadfastness in what you've done, and let me show you how that has impacted my life as a young person. And I think as much as we say we want to have more young people in the church, when we get them, we don't give them any space to talk. So I think particularly with, older congregations, and I've been, we were joking when we were in the green room about how in the Episcopal Church, like, I'm considered a younger person at age 57. I'm like still a younger person in the Episcopal Church. I'm still often the youngest person at an Episcopal gathering. But if we let's invite some of those younger voices who are also grappling and engaging in the world as part of their vocation, to have space and time and be in meaningful dialogue, and not just kind of correcting them, telling them what they should be thinking, but to really kind of invite that. And I know in my family, it's like that was like the Christmas tradition, right? It's like all the young people had to come out, and we had to like play the piano, or we had to sing a song, or we had to do a dance, like all right, like Heidi's turn, go play the piano. It's like horrifying, right? But let's do that in church in a way that is not quite so horrifying. But so there are some, for Asian American communities anyway, there are some cultural practices that we might return to in order to create that dialogue, that intergenerational dialogue. And Winnie's laughing, like all these people were like, because like you're like remembering the trauma of that. Yes.
Trauma is the right word. I do remember that. And Asian trauma. So this is Heidi's work, and so that it's been yes. And in addition, I think that idea of intergenerational conversation, that if you're 80, there's probably a 15-year-old in your life that you want to be relevant to and you want to know. I think also it's all about storytelling ultimately, and whether that's a storytelling of a place, like learning our history, or storytelling because something happens and is in the news, like that. I think doing anti-racism work, or kind of doing that work not connected to something else, can feel really hard if people aren't interested. But it's almost that there's some opportunities where it really it's hard anyway, but where it actually is kind of filling out something that everybody expects to talk about or wants to talk about, or even helps to raise up some things that people should be talking about, want to think about. The history part can feel like you're actually pushing at something that hurts, but also for most of us, it wasn't us. So it can create another way to kind of contextualize why these larger issues that are playing out around the world, around the country, might be relevant in our local community. I've always also been, this is also a very holy faith story. It's a holy faith question, right? When we had to talk about sexuality, or try to get a conversation going about sexuality, as we started to, I think Gary used to tell the story, as he started to talk about it up front, that some of the older ladies had a bulletin up, and it was at the senior brunch or something that they were talking about this. And finally, when he got them to stop and tell him why they weren't what they were talking about, they were basically pointing to all the gay people that had been in the church historically that they remembered. So it wasn't like he was actually really introducing a new subject. It was just people hadn't decided to talk about it. So I think sometimes like how you get people to talk about the thing they're not used to talking about in that space is a little bit of the journey.
Thank you, panelists. And we have one final closing question, which is, would you share with us a closing thought to challenge and empower us as instruments for change in our world today? What would you share with us to do that?
I think one of the value of listening to Heidi and Winnie and in Yein in a degree room, just listening to each other's stories as Asian Americans. Again, I'm the oldest. So you were talking Heidi, about in your congregations you're the youngest. Well, I'm the oldest of you three here, but my story in becoming an Asian American, is a process. So what is that process? What were the triggers, influences, whatever that made you aware of your Asian American bodiliness? I mean, that if you were born Asian American, you've been Asian American all along, but when was it in your story, in your journey, where you acknowledged it, okay? And then what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about, not only your own story, but in your story of relationships with others, maybe your family, your neighbor, your community, your religious congregation. So I would just, we've shared some stories this evening, or what, and what is your own particular story as an Asian American Christian? And then where do you go from there?
I think even when we talk about kind of, what does it mean to be an AP, a Christian? And it just means so many different things. I immigrated from Korea in the 60s, and, Yein came later, and our understanding of Korea and our understanding of the United States are vastly different. Although, we do like to go to restaurants together when I'm in LA. And just, allowing ourselves the space to disrupt this notion that, well, the Episcopal Church is a white church, because that just obliterates the history of all of us. But also to not allow ourselves to be sort of commodified in terms of our Asianness, that it's some kind, I loved what Winnie was saying about solidarity and particularity. And, so some of that is understanding, Koreans were oppressed by the Japanese, but Korean Americans during the Japanese American internment were benefiting from the Japanese American internment, right? So we have to understand that complexity, and that's that God part. And as we understand that complexity, understand also what is it that we really are holding on to and really want to hold on to. What is it that we're holding on to because it's just so embedded in us, and maybe it's not serving us, and what are the things that we are, again, learning from one another through sharing our stories, because all of that, as Gale has so brilliantly pointed out, is the making of Asian America. Right. As we are embodying those stories, as we are living those experiences, we are making the story, we are making the identity, and it's all good. It's all good. I mean, I still love my uncles who had the big homophobic moment on social media, and it, like, my daughter's not going to be honest with them about who she is, and I see that as a loss. So what is my complicity in having created that system in my family? And what is my role in trying to disrupt it and dismantle it? So, yeah, I mean, all of it. Identity is iterative. Even when we, I mean, like, I grew up with the "we need more Calgon, ancient Chinese secret" commercial. And, like, people would, like, my friends would come to school and they would point to me and they'd be like, "Ancient Chinese secret," like, that's part of my embodied experience. So, like, for me, like, the fact that K-pop became, like, really cool, like, all of a sudden, like, it became cool to be Korean. I was like, when the hell did that happen? When did people start liking our food? Because when I was a kid, people said our food was smelly and horrible, right? So, it's coming to terms with all of that. And that's not the whole of who we are,
Yeah.
It's not the whole of who we are.
Well, first, Korean food is the best food. But but in terms of other good news, I think part of what you see in Asian American theology and Asian theologies across the board is one of the things we get in Asian American theology in particular is the experience of the migrant, even if we're not first or second generation. And that is the story of a lot of the Bible. That's a move of people that are moving. So we bring some gifts and some perspectives, and we need to honor that. It took time in my life to recognize that it was a unique perspective, that it wasn't what everyone saw. And this is a tough one because we can't really do this for one another. But my experience is what people want and are looking for in church community is some kindness and someone that is interested in them, or at least will make enough space for them. And our work, I think, is to welcome one another and let people really know they're welcome and expect that we have a lot to learn from one another, and we'll learn a lot about ourselves if we make that effort with one another in our neighborhoods. And literally, I mean, it kind of comes down to at the end, we just want some kindness and some tenderness, most of us, right? That we're not going to be, that horrible assumptions aren't going to be made, that we're not going to be treated badly, that we're not going to be treated as though we have assumed or presumed or taken something if we speak authentically for who we are. That's kind of all anyone's asking for. And I wonder sometimes if that weird outsider space that Asian Americans always hold, right? I remember being in an Episcopal meeting where someone I really respect told me basically to sit down because I asked, if we use the word Indian, what does that mean for me? And they just didn't want to deal with the complication of the word I had used, but that meant me. And the little person literally told me to sit down. Like, right, like I shouldn't be here is what I heard. But I think what they were saying is, I know how to think of these categories, and you're not supposed to add a new category. You're supposed to fit into our categories. And I wonder if a lot of the Asian American experience isn't saying, actually, let me tell you my story and what it means for people that are welcoming. And I think we're all of us in the Asian American community. And part of that for me comes when I came out, my community became other Asian Americans that were queer. And so I got this really cool, diverse, I have an array of South Asian friends that most South Asians don't have because of my queerness. Most South Asians are within, and I would have been within their own communities because of how our culture works. But instead, all the gay people got together, which is, in the 80s, which was such a gift for me. But so that idea of Asian makes sense to me because of this identity that was pushed outside of the communities that I come from. Without the Episcopal Church, I don't get to go to church. I recognize that very clearly. What my primary identity really is as an Episcopal priest. That's most of where I have lived for the last 20 years. And I am so grateful for that space. But I think we don't begin, and we talked about this in the green room, we don't begin to understand what a great gift it is. And we hoard it and we don't share it. And it is not nearly what it could be if we offered it to more.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you, the panelists, for encouraging us and telling your stories, the power of storytelling, the importance of being thoughtful to engage the complexities, to be able to, just be kind and to each other, and also to recognize the importance of us as a people of migration. I'm still marinating in these thoughts, and I hope that there would be more opportunities to engage these topics. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's just such a pleasure to have you three with us. And Yein, thank you for moderating this conversation. I wish we could just all give them a virtual hand and applaud just the thoughtfulness and just how you just all brought it and encouraged us to more. The gathering is a space for this, for a space for storytelling and for us to feel empowered to make the church and the world a more beautiful and an empowered space. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for those participants that have, those of you that have joined us today to participate in this. We value that you value this space as well. I just want to offer some closing thoughts and to make a few announcements. Thank you also for Bishop Diane Bruce and Bishop John Taylor and Canon McCarthy, who support so much the space, the gathering. And especially Melissa McCarthy, thank you for being the Zoom host for today, and the gathering team for all the creativity and the hard work that you put into making this event possible. We hope that you all stay connected to us. On your program, you'll see that you can sign up to join us on our mailing list, and there is a Facebook page that you can join as well. And we also have a YouTube channel. This event will be posted on our YouTube channel, so please feel free to tell your friends and use our videos to share with others, because we want to collectively engage in sharing our stories and empowering for change. One quick announcement is this coming Wednesday, we have the Gathering Spot, which is a smaller group fellowship time for people in the gathering. So we encourage you to join us. It's a group where we just get to explore knowing each other, telling our stories, and empowering for change. And so I think the registration, we'll post the registration for that on the chat, and we hope many of you can join us. And if you'd like to support the gathering financially, we have a link through which you can donate to support our ministry also. And we'd like to close with prayer. So we'd like to introduce Sharon Crandall, who is also a member of the gathering planning team, to close our time in prayer and send us off.
Thank you, Peter. Most loving and gracious God, we thank you for this incredible gathering today. We are grateful for the wisdom and passion of Heidi, Winnie, and Gale. May their words and stories continue to wash over us in the coming days and weeks as we journey to discover who shall we be. Give us strength to stand in solidarity and our own particularity. May we strive to live to embody your word. And may we always have the courage to disrupt white supremacy. We stand in awe and wonder at the reality that you created us in your image. Help us to remember there is nothing we need to say or do to embrace our divine identity. It is who we are. May we strive to see the divine within ourselves and in all people. We ask this in the name of Jesus, the Christ. Amen.
Thank you all for joining us this evening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and hope to see many of you back in our next gathering events.